There's a specific kind of workday that feels productive on paper and devastating in practice. You sat at your desk for 8 hours. You answered emails, jumped into a meeting, started a report, got a Slack message, responded, went back to the report, checked your phone, answered another email, started the report again. By evening, the report is half finished. You're exhausted in a way that feels disproportionate to what actually got done, and somewhere in the back of your mind is a quiet sense that the day escaped you. It did, but not for the reasons most people assume. In 2005, researcher Gloria Mark at UC Irvine began tracking knowledge workers throughout their actual workdays, not their reported workdays, not their idealized schedules, but the real sequence of what they did, minute by minute, with an observer in the room recording every shift in attention. What she found changed the way cognitive scientists think about distraction. After every interruption, a notification, a colleague stopping by, a message, a momentary impulse to check something, it took workers an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to the original task at the same level of cognitive engagement they had before the interruption. 23 minutes for a distraction that may have lasted 30 seconds. This video is about why, not as a productivity tip. As a neurological fact about how attention actually works, and why the cost of interruption is so wildly disproportionate to its duration. What attention actually is, the mechanism. To understand why recovery takes 23 minutes, you first need to understand what focused attention actually requires the brain to do. When you sit down to work on a complex task, writing, analysis, coding, anything that requires holding multiple variables in mind simultaneously, the brain is not simply focusing. It is constructing a temporary architecture. Working memory loads the relevant information, the context of the project, the variables in play, the thread of reasoning you were following, the next steps you were building toward. The prefrontal cortex maintains that architecture actively, suppressing irrelevant information, holding the structure in place, preventing interference from competing inputs. The brain's attentional networks orient toward the task and away from everything else. This construction takes time. Research suggests it takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes of uninterrupted engagement for the brain to reach what cognitive scientists call a state of deep attentional engagement, the state in which complex multi-step work becomes genuinely possible. When an interruption occurs, the architecture collapses. Working memory drops the context. The prefrontal cortex releases its suppression of competing inputs. The thread is lost, and when you return, the construction has to begin again. From scratch, not from where you left off. The 23 minutes is not recovery time in the sense of healing. It is rebuild time. The brain reconstructing the temporary cognitive structure that the interruption dismantled. The attentional residue that makes it worse. In 2009, organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy at the University of Minnesota identified a phenomenon that explained why the cost of interruption is even higher than the rebuild time alone suggests. She called it attentional residue. When attention is pulled away from a task, whether by an external interruption or by an internal impulse, part of the cognitive system remains oriented toward the original task even after attention has nominally shifted. The brain continues processing the incomplete work in the background, allocating resources to the unfinished thread while simultaneously trying to engage with the new demand. This split is not metaphorical. It is a measurable division of cognitive resources. Leroy's research found that subjects who switched tasks before completing the first one performed significantly worse on the new task and showed neurological markers consistent with divided attention, even when they reported feeling fully focused on the new activity. The interruption doesn't just cost you the rebuild time when you return, it costs you the quality of attention on everything you do in between. The meeting you attend immediately after being pulled from deep work, the email you write mid-task, the decision you make during the interruption itself, all of it happens under the cognitive shadow of the unfinished work. Why the modern work environment is specifically designed to maximize this cost. Gloria Mark's 2005 study found that knowledge workers were interrupted, on average, every 3 minutes and 5 seconds throughout the workday. In a follow-up study more than a decade later, that number had dropped. Not because workplaces had gotten better at protecting attention, but because workers had internalized the interruption pattern so thoroughly that they had begun interrupting themselves. By 2016, the average time workers spent on a single task before self-interrupting was 1 minute and 15 seconds. The architecture of the contemporary digital work environment is not accidentally interruptive. It is structurally optimized for interruption. Email clients display unread counts. Slack channels have notification defaults set to alert for every message. Smartphones generate an average of 80 notifications per day for the average American adult. Browsers open in multiple tabs by default. Every one of these design decisions imposes a cost that the 23-minute research makes quantifiable. If a worker is interrupted every 3 minutes, and each interruption requires 23 minutes of rebuild time, and rebuild periods overlap and compound, the mathematics of focused work become almost impossible. The workday becomes a series of interrupted reconstructions, none of them completing before the next interruption begins, each one leaving attentional residue that degrades the quality of every subsequent attempt. This is not a description of bad workers or poor discipline. It is a description of a cognitive system operating in an environment it was not designed for, under conditions that systematically prevent it from doing what it does best. The multitasking myth and what's actually happening. The cultural response to this problem has largely been to celebrate multitasking, to treat the ability to manage multiple simultaneous demands as a skill, even a competitive advantage. The neuroscience is unambiguous. Multitasking, as most people use the term, does not exist. What appears to be simultaneous processing of multiple tasks is rapid sequential switching between them. The brain cannot maintain two streams of complex attentional engagement at the same time. What it can do is switch between them very quickly enough that the switching is not consciously perceived as switching. The cost of this rapid switching is identical to the cost of any other interruption, compressed into smaller intervals. Every switch triggers attentional residue from the task being left. Every return requires partial reconstruction of the cognitive architecture that was abandoned. The switching happens faster, but the cost per switch does not decrease. Research from the Institute of Psychiatry in London found that workers who multitasked, simultaneously managing email while performing cognitive tasks, showed a temporary drop in IQ equivalent to losing a night of sleep. Not because multitasking is intellectually demanding, because the constant switching prevents any single task from receiving the sustained engagement required for quality output. The cost that never appears on the calendar. Here is what makes the 23-minute finding specifically uncomfortable. The cost of every interruption is invisible in the way most people account for their time. A 3-minute distraction appears in the day as 3 minutes lost. The actual cost, 23 minutes of degraded reconstruction, plus the attentional residue that shadows everything in between, appears as nothing, as vague underperformance, as the sense that the day was busy but nothing got done, as exhaustion that seems disproportionate to the output. The brain is paying a tax that doesn't appear on any receipt. Gloria Mark's most recent research has added a dimension that makes the picture more complex. Not all interruptions carry the same cost. Interruptions that occur at natural task boundaries, moments where a subtask has completed and the cognitive architecture has naturally released, carry significantly lower rebuild costs than interruptions that occur mid-construction. The brain, when allowed to reach a natural stopping point, deposits the context into long-term memory more effectively. The rebuild, when it comes, draws on a more stable foundation. This means the timing of interruptions matters as much as their frequency. A notification that arrives when you've just finished a paragraph costs less than one that arrives 3 sentences in. The environment doesn't know this. It interrupts at random. Gloria Mark, in interviews about her research, has noted something that the data alone doesn't fully capture. The workers she observed were not frustrated by interruption in the way an outside observer might expect. Many of them had adapted. They had restructured their sense of what work felt like to accommodate the constant switching. They had, in her words, learned to work in a fragmented way. What they had not done was produce less fragmented work. The output reflected the interruption pattern regardless of how normalized the pattern had become. The brain adapts behaviorally to conditions that it cannot adapt to neurologically. It learns to feel comfortable in environments that are still costing it 23 minutes per distraction, every distraction throughout the day. There is also a stress dimension to Mark's later research that complicates the picture further. Workers who experience higher rates of interruption showed elevated cortisol levels compared to days with lower interruption rates, even when the total volume of work completed was similar. The fragmentation itself, independent of workload, was registering as a biological stressor. The brain was not only paying the cognitive cost of reconstruction, it was paying a physiological cost for operating in a state of perpetual incomplete engagement. The two costs compound. The exhaustion at the end of a fragmented day is not simply the sum of the tasks completed. It is the accumulated weight of dozens of incomplete constructions, each one started and abandoned before the cognitive architecture could stabilize. There is something worth sitting with in what this research reveals. Not about productivity, but about the relationship between the environment and the brain's actual capacity. The 23-minute figure is not a personal failing. It is not evidence that some people are better at focusing than others, or that discipline is the variable that determines whether the cost is paid. It is a description of how attentional architecture works, consistently across subjects, regardless of how experienced or capable or motivated they are. What varies is the interruption rate, and the interruption rate is, in most modern work environments, a function of design decisions made by people who were not thinking about the 23-minute cost when they made them. The brain you bring to work every day is capable of sustained, complex, high-quality engagement. What the research describes is not a limitation of that brain. It is what happens to it in a specific kind of environment. Whether that environment is the right one for the work being asked of it is a question the 23-minute finding raises and leaves carefully unanswered. Mind translator, psychology, translated clearly.